What's up everybody, and welcome back to another synth video. Now hopefully you enjoyed that intro jam and hopefully it gave you an idea of what this video is all about. Today I'm going to be doing a shootout of the amazing GS Music E7 versus the classic Prophet 6 from Sequential. Now the E7, for those of you guys that don't know, is a fully analog 7-voice VCO synthesizer from a tiny company in Argentina. And when I got this thing about 6 or 7 months ago, I was absolutely blown away by just how good it sounds, for the fact that these guys are, nowhere near as well known as some of the bigger companies, and the price was really reasonable. Now, if you haven't seen my full video on the E7, go check it out above, but today we're gonna shoot this thing out against one of the most famous, classic, and more expensive analog synths on the market, the Sequential Prophet 6. Now, two things before we begin. My self-released EP just hit 1 million streams already on Spotify. That means the absolute world. Go check it out, go stream it if you haven't already. It's called The Space Between Two Halves of a Heart. Thank you so much for all the love on that EP. Secondly, I wanted to give a big shout out to GS Music for sponsoring this video. They didn't tell me what to say, and they certainly aren't seeing this video before it goes live, but thank you so much to them for helping this channel keep going. It really means the world. Make sure to like and subscribe, and let's get started. Alright, so starting off, we've got a really similar sound dialed up between the two synths, and I think this is a great place to look at the different character of how they can sound. So the third wave here is going to be my MIDI controller for the GS Music E7, and then the Prophet 6, of course, has its own keyboard. So anytime you see me playing this keyboard, the sound is coming from here, and anytime you hear me up here, obviously it's from here. Alright, let's get started. So check this out. They sound pretty similar, yet extremely unique and distinct. Now, I want to show you with one more example of the same sound in the kind of style of music that I usually like to make. Now, for me, the two main differences I hear, because they definitely do sound fairly similar. I mean, they're both analog synths with similar amounts of voices, similar oscillator structures, but the two biggest differences are the filters sound quite different, and then just the overall thickness and fatness. And I think that's where I was most impressed. The GS Music E7 is unabashedly fatter than my Prophet 6. If you're looking for that super rich, fat, vintage sounding analog synth sound, then look no further. In my humble opinion, the E7 is unbeatable, and the only thing that really comes close is something like my Oberheim. The Prophet 6, on the other hand, is a little bit more modern sounding. It doesn't have quite as much weight and heft as the E7, which does make it easier to mix in the mix. So let's go ahead and dial in init patches on both synths and do a full comparison. Alright, so I've dialed up an init patch on both synths, which sounds like a saw wave, sounds like this. Now, while of course sawtooths on their own are going to sound similar, once we start adding in different things like mixing the oscillators, doing the different wave shapes, we start to hear some significant differences. So here on the GS Music E7, let's go through the oscillator section. So if I go ahead and start playing with the different wave shapes, we have saw, triangle, saw, triangle, and then square. The square wave has this great sounding pulse width modulation. Which we can modulate with either the LFO or an envelope. What's really cool about the E7 is that you can actually mix and match the square with one of the other three oscillators, which you can't do on the Prophet 6. So for example, if I wanted a blend of square wave and triangle, or square wave and saw triangle, that sounds really cool, nice and metallic, or square and saw. Now, if we bring in two oscillators together on the E7, that's where the magic happens. I said this before in my full video, but these have got to be some of the best sounding analog oscillators. They're absolutely wild and untamed, and myself and other people who own this synth have really all kind of agreed it sounds really vintage. Even though this is a modern synth made in the 21st century, it sounds like something from the 70s. So we bring in oscillator 2. And even with no detune, it already sounds really fat. Let's bring that back to a saw. Bring that down a couple octaves. And let's tune them. Amazing sounding, right? So another really unique feature of the E7 is we've got the ability to have two sub-oscillators. So on the Prophet 6, we only have one, and it's a triangle, which I've talked about before. I'll get into it. It's pretty useless because of the fact it's a triangle. On the E7, we have two square wave sub-oscillators. That's one, so fat, and this is two. Huge. On the Prophet 6, we have a similar setup with two VCOs, but these ones can only go smoothly between wave shapes, meaning you can't combine necessarily all the same combinations of wave shapes as you can on the E7. So we've got our triangle wave, through saw, through square. And anything in the middle you can use, which is nice, but it's not as flexible. Now, if we go to our square wave, we have a very similar pulse width modulation, which is great, which we can modulate, but we have to give up our only LFO. We'll get more into that later, but there's only one LFO on the Prophet 6 versus 3 on the E7. So let's go ahead back to saw wave, and let's bring in oscillator 2. So right off the bat, you notice that they're not quite as naturally detuned as on the E7. And like I mentioned, that's just something that the E7 really does excel at. If you want more of a vintage sound, I'd go E7. If you want more of a modern sound, I'd go Prophet 6. So as you bring in the oscillators, you're going to want to add some vintage knob, which is a really cool feature of the Prophet 6. You can hear that around halfway. It starts to get to that vintage wild sweet spot where it's not so out of tune it's unusable, but it's also not quite as modern and clean as the Prophet 6 normally is. So let's do some detune here. Sounds beautiful as well. Now I mentioned the sub oscillator on the Prophet 6. We only have one of them, and it's a triangle wave, unfortunately. So you can use it to add more sub, but you're never going to get those really thick, fat sounds as we have on the E7. So that's what this sounds like coming in. It is a cool sound if you just want extra sub bass, but for me personally, I prefer the absolute thickness of the E7 is just pretty hard to beat here overall. Next up, we have the filter sections. Now I'm going to continue with this sound to keep things simple, but the filters are probably one of the biggest differences on the synths. So on the E7, we have this big chunky knob, which is amazing. It's just very, very grabbable, very easy to grab, and it's a ladder filter. So if you guys know your filters, this is modeled after a Moog filter. So it's 24 dB per octave. As you bring up resonance, you lose a lot of bass. So you're going to want to be careful there. So if we go ahead, if we crank resonance, we lose all our bass. So that's one thing I'll say about the E7 is the filter sounds amazing, but it takes a little bit more work to coax the sweet spots out of it than something like the Prophet 6, which the filter pretty much just always sounds good no matter what you do. But let's do a couple filter sweeps here going back and forth. So one, that's with no resonance on the E7 and then no resonance on the Prophet. with half resonance on the E7. With half resonance on the Prophet. You'll notice there's no bass drop off on the Prophet, which makes it a little bit easier. That is something you have to get used to on the E7. But once you get used to it, it sounds amazing. And with full resonance on the E7. Watch your ears. And finally, with full resonance on the Prophet, again, watch your ears. One thing I really dislike that the Prophet does, that I don't know why sequential synths do this, but you can hear with the resonance high, it tunes itself chromatically, so you can't get those luscious, smooth filter sweeps. Of course, when you play a key with an envelope or an LFO and you use that to modulate the filter, it's smooth, but just for doing manual filter sweeps, if you like to do that a lot, then definitely go for the E7 because you can't do that very well on the Prophet 6. All right, so the next section is probably the biggest difference and the biggest area where the E7 frankly just outclasses the Prophet, and that is in modulation. Now on the E7, you have 3 full LFOs, 2 of which are polyphonic, can do crazy things like key tracking, which I love, and the third one is more for, your typical performance LFO, mod wheel, aftertouch to vibrato, that kind of thing. But essentially the 2 main LFOs are completely polyphonic and you can modulate almost anything on the keyboard with them. So with the E7, the way you implement modulation is actually pretty ingenious. Instead of having a mod matrix with lots of menu diving, they've kept it completely knob per function, which I love. So if we, for example, wanted to go and modulate the filter, we simply turn up LFO1 mod. If we wanted it to be LFO2 instead, we turn up LFO2 mod. We can adjust the rate, all the way into audio rates, the shape, different settings like I mentioned, like if it's polyphonic or my favorite, keyboard tracking. That right there is a classic Prophet style sound where the cross mod, traditionally, in this case LFO, follows the keyboard all the way up. It's a wonderful sound and you can do it no problem with the E7. We also have some really unique modulation, such as the stereo motion of the sound. So for example, if I turn up the stereo motion, you can actually hear the synth sound going back and forth, all of the voices between my ears. This to me is way more interesting than standard keyboard tracking and something that I've really not seen on a lot of other synths, the ability to actually modulate the pan back and forth. That's typically reserved for more complicated digital synths like my Third Wave here or the Novation Summit. But seeing it on an actual, full-on VCO polysynth and analog synth is really cool. Now on the Prophet 6, this is, like I mentioned, probably the biggest area of weakness compared to the E7. All we have is one LFO, which is monophonic. So for example, if I wanted to go modulate the filter, turn up the amount, turn up the frequency, turn down my filter. We have all the same shapes on both, but now as I play different notes, there's nothing we can do to make that effect like we heard before without giving up oscillator 2. So for example, if we wanted to create that effect we heard before with the cascading LFOs, what we'd actually have to do, let's go ahead and turn off the LFO, we'd have to go ahead and put our second oscillator into low frequency mode, and then go ahead and give it up, meaning we take it out of the signal, so our sound is simpler now. And then we go up to our polymod section, change oscillator 2 to the filter. change the shape here and frequency. So it's absolutely possible to get the same kind of sounds on both, but on the E7, we haven't given up any of our oscillators and we still have 2 full LFOs to play with, whereas on the Prophet 6, we have to give up one of our oscillators and then we still only have 1 monophonic LFO normally. All right, so final section here are effects. Now here, honestly, it's a bit of a toss-up. Neither of the synths have my favorite effects, and I would really recommend grab a great pedal. I've got lots of videos on pedals if you want to learn my favorite pedals with synths. But starting with the E7, we've got a delay. We can change the time, the feedback, and the type. I tend to leave it in ping pong. Honestly, there's not a huge difference to my ears from the types, but ping pong with a slower time is pretty nice. We've also got, which I prefer to the delay, we've got a chorus, which is, again, it's not my favorite chorus in the world, but a chorus on an analog synth is a really great feature. So the chorus, again, we can change our rate. I like to have my chorus rate really slow, so starting fast, the depth, and the mix. My problem with the chorus on the E7 is it does wash out the sound if you put it past halfway. Gets all phasey, right? But with a little bit of it at about a quarter, it sounds really nice, especially for big chords. So for the Prophet 6, we've got 2 effects as well, but unlike the E7, we are able to change them. Now that sounds great in theory, but again, the Prophet 6 effects aren't my favorite either. So we've got our typical fare of reverbs. We've got stuff like flangers, phasers. Now the one effect I will say is really, really great on the Prophet 6 that I wish the E7 had, and this is probably the only area where realistically I have to give a clear point to the Prophet 6 over the E7, is the distortion. Now, it's not my favorite analog distortion in the world, and frankly, you could get the same results by just running your E7 through a very cheap pedal, but it's there, it's built in, and I do really like to add just a little bit of distortion to my patches. Alright, so hopefully that comparison gave you an idea of just how amazing the E7 can sound stacked up against one of the most famous analog synths on the market, and one that costs significantly more than it does. I really do think that more people need to check out this synth because I use it all the time and it's one of my favorite sounding pieces of gear I own. Now, let's finish things off with a couple of sound demos, but as always, if you've gotten this far in the video and you're still watching, thank you so much for the support. Please remember to like and subscribe, hit the notification bell, and I will see you guys in the next video.